Hello and welcome back to 4th Age Guides. In this episode we are looking at the Kingdom of Rhovanion on the battlefield. This is a battle guide for this faction, one of the more challenging ones in the mod, both on the campaign and on the battlefield. They've got a fairly idiosyncratic military, and that's what we are going to be exploring today. I have a custom battle set up here that we're looking at the replay of for Rhovanion versus the Kingdom of Dale. Dale is likely to be your major opponent for the beginning and potentially mid-game. You will have other and larger fish to fry later on, but Dale will be more than enough of a challenge initially. The problem with Dale is that they have a very well-balanced roster with some strong infantry, some decent cav, some good archers, and your roster is mostly cav-focused, specifically light cavalry. You will be wanting to make heavy use of your light cav, and I've brought 6 of these Rovanian Scouts. This is a tier 2 unit for you. They're fairly low tech, no frills, but they do have spears and they've got a great charge value. So what we're doing here is sandwiching some of the more technically powerful cavalry of Dale between our 2 Rovanian Scouts. We're going to really quickly rout these guys, as you can see, taking minimal losses to ourselves and just wiping out that unit of Riders of Dale. And so we've done extremely well on that charge. Now, that's not all we have to worry about, of course, because Dale's infantry arm is extremely powerful, and we won't be able to rout them as fast as we did just there to the cavalry. Cav tends to be a very good target for those Rovanian Scouts because you can eliminate them very quickly. So with the heavier infantry of Dale, like these Hearthmen, charges will be effective, but you do need to combine them with other things. What I really want to do in this battle is snipe the enemy general, and that should be your primary goal playing as Rovanion, because once you do that, all of these other units, even the very heavily armed Black Spears, which are such a dangerous unit for you, even the Hearthmen, are going to be quite easy to rout. But unfortunately, in this fight, the AI General is not going to quite put himself out there early on. We will get him in a little while, but not before we're going to try to do something about those Hearthmen of Dale. In addition to your light cav, another important arm is your archers. Now, these are mostly used to sort of set up a screen for your other units and to bait other units into cav charges. So as you can see, I'm kind of sacrificing that unit of Romanian Hunters and charging in with my March Wardens and Generals unit, and we're going to take out the enemy general there. Very important to do that. Now, for our heavier cav, we do have these couple of options. The March Wardens are a tier 3 unit, very important for you. They are essentially kind of like medium cavalry, but they're very important because, unlike your Rovanian Scouts, March Wardens are going to stick around fight after fight. They're going to take far fewer losses. They're just going to be much more durable. Your Bodyguard unit is Rovanian Nobles, and you do have to watch out. I was a little sloppy there and got caught by some Dale Watch. But these are an interesting unit. They have javelins as well as long spears for melee. But they can be somewhat fragile. You can see they don't have a terribly large unit size unless you're dealing with like a king or your heir. And so as a result of that, they may not do so well in the charge. They're not going to quickly deal a devastating blow like with your larger unit sizes on those Rovanian Scouts or even the March Wardens. And so what I tend to do is pair them up with your heavier cavalry and use them kind of in tandem. You can see the archers, I'm just letting them run themselves. They're just on skirmish, and really I'm not too worried about what happens to them. I have to focus my micromanagement on the cavalry, especially the cav in the back, because once I'm dealing with these few units of infantry, I am trying to take advantage of opportunities to take out the enemy archers, which is not going to be too much of a problem. In terms of infantry, though, we do have some other options. We do have some skirmish types. At Tier 1, in fact, you'll find Rovanian Foresters, a very, very good unit. They're not going to stand up in melee, of course, but they will do a good job in terms of skirmish. They have, I believe, a better ranged attack than your Rovanian Hunters. Of course, a much shorter range, but they can keep skirmishing away and shooting into the backs of enemy infantry, and they're going to do quite well, even if they get caught up in a melee, potentially. You do have also the option to train these Rovanian Rangers, which are another skirmisher type. These guys, I believe, have run out of ammunition, and so they're now using their axes, and they're just playing keep away with the Black Spears. Again, I am not paying attention to them right now because I'm trying to work all of my cav. But the Rovanian Rangers also have a mercenary variant that you are able to get very early in the Brown Lands, which is just to the west of your starting position. And this is a pretty solid unit. Their ranged attack is very good, and they're even decent in melee. So again, you don't want to get caught by these very heavy infantry types if you can help it, but you can at least run them around the battlefield and help in a fight if that opens up an opportunity. My only other infantry unit that I have here are these Rivenian Spearmen. This is another tier 1 unit. I brought 3 units to the fight, so really only 3 dedicated melee infantry types in this battle. You can see basically what I'm using them here is something of an anvil, but you don't have much of an anvil as Rovanian. These are a pretty soft unit. Now, they do have the ability to form a hedgehog formation, which is sort of a shieldtron from Barbarian Invasion. That's when all the spears and shields sort of turn out into this circle shape. That is very useful against cavalry. I especially use it when I'm fighting in a siege defense. You can put a unit of these guys in the hedgehog formation in the center of the city plaza, and enemy cavalry, even very strong cavalry, will break against them very surprisingly easily. So the hedgehog formation is not one to be underestimated. But in an open field, I don't often find a use for it. Partly that's because in these open field battles, my attention is so often elsewhere, trying to manage all the different skirmishing and cavalry units. So in this situation, they're basically just holding up the enemy. Certainly you want them to be fighting cavalry if possible, but that's not always something that you can guarantee. With most of the other units in the field in flight, these Hearthmen of Dale, already utterly tired, already shaken, are going to be breaking very quickly, even though I don't have a great charge set up here. We actually do have a good charge from the Rovanian March Wardens, so this ought to be it. And there we have our victory. Now, the thing you do want to get used to when fighting as Rovanian is taking a lot of losses. We did very well here because, again, we did those repeated cavalry charges. In terms of the losses that we took for our Rovanian Scouts, we lost well over half of 3 of our 6 units. The other 3 units did quite well, but you do need to prepare yourself for having to retrain. And that is one of the strategic problems that Rovanian can run into. On the campaign map, their settlements are far enough apart that you're not always able to get quick reinforcements, and so retraining is kind of a pain. So to that end, the March Wardens are going to be kind of the heroes. Let's go over the basic roster, how it sets up, and then we can look at some of the more unique units and local levies from different parts of the map that you can train. So Tier 1 looks like this in your homelands. You'll have those Rovanian Spearmen and those Rovanian Foresters. I like to have a unit of each at least in settlements for garrison duties, even if it's otherwise completely empty. The Rovanian Foresters, though, are the ones I tend to train and bring with me on a campaign, for the reasons that you saw in that battle. You can basically set them on skirmish, put them relatively nearby your other melee infantry, and they'll perform pretty well. Even if they get caught, they have spears for use in melee, and they got big shields, so they'll do pretty well against light cav, or you can send them as flankers. Rivenian Spearmen, again, that hedgehog formation is very, very useful, and against cav they're going to do quite well, but they are going to take a lot of losses against infantry and against archers. So you don't, basically as Rovanian, you're not going to rely on a battle line, because as we'll see, you don't really have one, at least for some time. At Tier 2 in your homelands, though, you will start to get more dedicated melee types, Rovanian Axemen, and they do have better attack, better defense, and better charge than your spearmen. But again, I tend not to rely on these guys too much. In part, that's because if you find yourself fighting, let's say, Rune or the Easterlings, which you likely will in the mid-game or maybe even the early part of the game, their equivalent Tier 2 axes are basically these guys, except that they have 90 men per unit. They're going to have better armor. They're going to war cry. They'll just cut through your own axemen. So I tend to maybe have a couple of these guys in a settlement where I'm training lots of troops for, let's say, anticipation of assault. if I imagine that I've got a settlement that's on the border and I expect it to come under attack, I will have a few units of Rovanian Axemen just to tie up enemy units in the streets. I'm not going to expect great things out of them, but they've got relatively low upkeep, and in the interior of a settlement, they're going to do better than a ton of cav. So a few units for those siege defenses are okay, but in the early years, you're probably not going to afford a lot of these. The other Tier 2 units are extremely useful, though, and you're going to want to train lots of them. These would be the Rovanian Hunters and the Rovanian Scouts. These are, of course, your archers. This is your only long-range units from your native roster, and so you should train a lot of them. In that fight, I brought 4 units. That's pretty typical for me in terms of what I train for the Rovanian Hunters. You could probably go a lot more than that, but I prefer to overload on cav and just use these as a just auto skirmish, set them up, kind of forget about them. They're there to bait the enemy, to charge them into potentially my spears or potentially into other heavier cav charges. And they're just there to get some kills while I focus on other things, but they are extremely useful. And if you've got them set up on the walls of a settlement, they're going to do well there also. Rovanian Scouts, again, you will need to get used to these guys. They can carry you well into the game, and you're going to want to train them throughout the campaign, honestly. There's never going to come a point when you feel like completely replacing them, I don't think. They're just cheaper in terms of upkeep. They're more readily available than your heavier cav, the March Wardens. And so why not? There's more of them. They have a great charge, and they're going to do a lot of good work for you. But I think the mistake people sometimes make, at least I did when I started playing Rovanion, was setting it up like a typical faction, right? Like you get a few spears, you get a few axes, you get a few archers, you get a few riders. If you just have a few Rovanian Scouts, you're not going to perform well. You need to have a bunch of them. So I like to have at least 6 in an army, and then that is augmented by even more cav, several units of March Wardens, maybe a couple of family members. So it's good to use your cavalry in mass. And if you play Rovanion, I think you'll find that you'll be pushed into a more cav-heavy army than you might have initially expected. But that's going to be what works for you in the long run. At Tier 3, your only unit that you get is Rovanian March Wardens. That's it. So this is basically your native roster. That said, this is an excellent unit, and I don't want to undersell it. Rovanian March Wardens have just a much better armor. As you can tell, the defense is more than twice that of your Scouts, and they've got a very good charge. Actually, it's even 1 point better than your Scouts, and better attack. So they're going to perform well in melee. That means you can leave them there to charge, leave them there to get the full effect of that charge bonus, and then even leave them in the fight for a little bit longer, even when the charge bonus has ended. And again, you can check when their charge is done by mousing over the unit in battle, and it'll tell you if it's charging or not. If it says in melee, they're no longer charging, and you may want to pull them out and try again if it doesn't look like the enemy's going to break quickly. You certainly want to pay attention to that with the Rovanian Scouts, because once their charge bonus wears off, they're just using that very low attack. But with the Rovanian March Wardens, you can afford to leave them in melee a bit longer because of that defense. So this is a great unit. This is going to allow you to sort of slow down the retraining train, because otherwise you're going to constantly be cycling your troops back to get them retrained, and that is a big drain on your population base. Playing as Rovanion is really the most sensitive faction to population, in my experience, in the 4th Age Total War, outside of the elves and the dwarves. Even on low taxes in your homelands, you're going to run into situations where you're dipping below 1,000 population, and the population floor is 400, so you can't train below 400 men in a settlement. And that means, you're going to go through a lot of population that's cutting into your income tax, and that's also, of course, potentially hurting your ability to train troops, especially if you're training these high population units like your archers and skirmishers and spearmen. So any unit you can have that needs to be retrained less is going to allow you to go farther and get more out of your settlements. So that's why I really, really value the March Wardens. Your bodyguard, again, is these Rovanian Nobles. We talked about that. They have a bit of a skirmish ability, very good missile attack with those javelins. And you want your king and your heir typically to be out in the field because they're going to be bringing the large unit size to this force. You're going to have, well into the 40s potentially for your king of Rhovanion in terms of numbers for his bodyguard, and that is much more effective than just the 21 that you see here in the custom battle screen. But again, you want to be somewhat careful about them. You may want to rely on the rally horn trick. You basically send this unit to charge, and then you can click the rally button, and then the general will sort of hold back while the rest of his unit charges in, and that'll preserve him if you're a bit worried about his survivability in combat. So again, I tend to find that these guys are a bit fragile sometimes. I don't just get them into a melee and leave them there. I get them into a good situation where it looks like they're liable to win or break the enemy, and then pull them out if that doesn't go well. Okay, so this is your native roster, essentially. But Rovanion does benefit from some very interesting, relatively local assimilation units, and these are units that you can train from settlements outside of your homelands. One is the Vassal Axeman. You can get these in Easterling settlements. So this is going to be anything pretty much in the same longitude as the Sea of Rune. So if you start going to the east, either south or north of the Sea of Rune, you may find these Vassal Axemen. They are pretty decent. Certainly an upgrade for your Rovanian Axemen. They've got the same number of men. The defense is a bit better. The attack can be significantly higher because that war cry is going to add, I believe it's a flat plus 10 for 30 seconds. So triggering the war cry is going to be useful for them. Of course, that's another thing you have to micromanage in a battle for a faction that's already pretty micro-intensive. But Vassal Axemen, why not? If you go into Rune, as you're likely to do at some point, you're going to want to train them, and they will be pretty reliable for you. It'll be kind of interesting to have a bit more effective infantry arm if you go into that route. Closer to home, though, you'll find these excellent Dorwinian Watch. And so, of course, this would be available from taking lands in Dorwinion. I think specifically Belligant. But Dorwinian Watch are the absolute best spearmen you can train. There's no question about it. Their defense is 31, which is more than twice the defense of your native Rovanian spearmen. They're going to be very expensive, of course, in upkeep, but by the time you can get them, you're probably going to be pretty good in terms of your economy. So definitely train a few units of these. Just a couple goes a long way. I wouldn't go nuts, but they're going to add a great deal of staying power to your infantry line, and you can actually begin to have an infantry line once you have these guys. A similar unit in terms of staying power is Mountain Guards. This may be a much later campaign thing. On the other hand, if you attack the dwarves early, you do start with a settlement right to your east, Nereg Zagil. This is one of the closest dwarven settlements to any Manish faction in terms of where you are situated compared to some other factions. And you can make great use of these guys relatively early if you make that a priority. If you go to war with Dale, you're going to be at war with the dwarves, and so it may make sense to loop over to Nereg Zagil before they start training a bunch of high-tech, terrifying dwarven units, and take it. If you go that route, I would recommend going heavy on skirmishers, going really heavy on cav, and really getting good at cycle charging. But if you are successful, eventually, it'll take a very long time to convert the province to a Manish population, but eventually you'll be able to train mountain guards, armor-piercing, hammer-wielding, extremely well-defended, well-armed infantry. So go for it if you can make that happen. For my money, though, the most likely unit I can get early on in terms of special units outside of my homelands is going to be the Retainer Longbowmen that you can find in Dale. So pretty much any place north of the river running, just north of your starting position, you will eventually be able to train Retainer Longbowmen. Now, the nice thing about having a very small native roster is that typically you also have a very short military development chain. There are only 3 tiers of military development for you, and that means that these assimilation units, these retainer type units, are only at tier 3 of your barracks. and that makes it just so much easier to get to. So if you go after Dale early, which I'm going to recommend in the campaign video, as you'll see shortly, you can get these retainer longbowmen very early. They have a considerable advantage in terms of range over your native hunters. Their missile attack is also better, and they are more robust in melee, both in terms of attack and defense. I would, of course, prefer to use these guys in terms of for range, rather than getting them into the fight, but they just have a bit more staying power if that should occur. So definitely take advantage of these retainer longbowmen. They're not even that expensive either, so they will add some extra reach to your archer battles. Now, a unit I did forget to mention, I guess this could be considered part of your native roster actually, is Rovanian Rangers, and these will be found in the Brown lands. Now again, there are mercenaries available in those lands before you even own the province, of course. You can also sometimes find these guys in Thrimfeld or the East Bight, just in the eastern part of Mirkwood. And so those are both very easy for you to access and get the mercenary variant of this unit. But eventually, if you build up the Mid-Deeping settlement, which is the settlement in the Brownlands, you can train these for yourself. Again, very good unit to have, kind of an upgrade of your Rovanian foresters. The attack and the missile attack is notably better. The defense is also a bit better, and they've got a heftier charge. So I would strongly recommend them. It sort of goes along with your kind of rough and rugged roster in terms of being a skirmish-heavy, cav-heavy, sort of guerrilla warfare type of faction. Let's see, other units that are available to you in Rohan, and this would be the last one, Retainer Scouts, so horse archers. This is actually a really nice addition to your roster if you head in that direction. And the thing, again, about Rovanion is you're probably going to be heading in lots of different directions. You occupy this very central position on the map, and so it's not too far for you to head west and find yourself across the Anduin in Rohan's territory. It's likely, unfortunately, that you'll come into conflict with the Reunited Kingdom, and this will bring war with Rohan. And so if that is the case, you may as well, if you can handle it, head across the river and pick up, eventually, some Retainer Scouts. Pretty straightforward unit. They've got bows as well as axes in melee, so they can kind of do double duty. And having ranged riders with a very long range is a very nice addition to your forces. So Rovanion has an interesting roster. You know, again, just looking at that native component, it really encourages you to be opportunistic, I guess, to sort of use your units to their fullest ability and strike with your cav, throwing in your hunters wherever they can, and hanging back probably with your infantry line. So it makes for a very different kind of play style. Typically, when you're fighting, you set up an anvil and then set a hammer. Well, Rovanion doesn't really have anvils. You got lots of hammers, so think of yourself as you're using a hammer to hit another hammer, and that's kind of what it feels like playing as Rovanion. It's a fun style, though. If you can get over the hump, there's a bit of a learning curve, but it is very rewarding when it works. So stay tuned for the campaign guide video for this faction. We'll get into more detail about the strategy, diplomatic situation, and more. And thank you for joining me, and I'll check you out in the next video. Take care, everybody.